Welcome again to my channel. In this channel I explore ancient texts, and the ancient texts I explore in this channel are those that have been around for quite some time, often thousands of years. And in this video we are going to look at some of the things that ancient historian Herodotus tells us ancient Egyptians used to do on day-to-day basis. Most of them are very interesting. He does have a long list of things that he noted that the Egyptians were doing. If you have not subscribed, subscribe so that you do not miss any of the videos that I publish. Now, I guess I'm not alone. There must be many people out there who try to understand how people in ancient society lived their life day to day. And when I come across a document that kind of like tries to share that, then I have to go through it, and I find it to be so interesting. And it was the case with reading Herodotus' book Histories. It covers a lot of things, and when it came to Egypt, or talking about Egypt, he did something that I really appreciate him doing, and that is trying to share the small day-to-day things that the Egyptians used to do, and we are going to go through some of those. So I'm going to talk about some of those. So he says that the Egyptians had a peculiar climate. Of course, the climate of Egypt is a land that doesn't really get rainfall, but it's also a land that is blessed because of this river that cuts through it, and they get everything from this river. They do farming, they get water and everything from this river. A river that, in fact, Herodotus explains that nobody knew where it was coming from. And I found that to be so interesting, especially being somebody who was born and brought up at the basin where much of the water that goes to the Nile comes from when it rains. Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, it rains there, and the rivers from all those three countries, and Rwanda and maybe Congo to some extent, flow into Lake Victoria, and then the water goes to Egypt. Now, back to this. So there is that peculiarity of ancient Egypt. So that was so different even to Herodotus. It wasn't the same as other parts where he had gone, Europe and Asia, where farming, for example, was done mostly through rainfall and things like that. So this is some of the interesting things he writes. He says, among the Egyptians, the women attend markets and traffic, but then men stay at home and weave. He says that most of the things that Egyptians were doing were like the opposite of what most of the societies he knew did. In most societies, it was the men who went out to do commerce, and things like that. But in Egypt, it's the women who went out to do commerce, and the men stayed at home to weave. And in other nations or in other society, it was often the women who weaved. But in Egypt, he found it interesting that it was the men who stayed at home and weaved, while the women went out to do commerce. And he also talks about weaving. He says that their weaving is they throw the wool upward. The other nations throw the wool upward, and the Egyptians throw it downward. I didn't really get that because I don't have much experience with weaving, but seems like that was something major to him that he had to record it, to explain it, or to point it out. Now, he talks about men carry burdens on their head and the women on their shoulders, which is interesting because I grew up in a society where women carry the things, whatever they are carrying, on their head, and men carry it on their shoulders. And Herodotus is kind of like telling us in most other societies, women carried stuff on their head and men carried stuff on their shoulders. But in Egypt, it was different. The women carried their stuff on the shoulders and the men carried the stuff on the head, and he found that to be weird. He also says the Egyptians eat themselves in their houses but eat outdoors. Like they go for bathroom purposes in the house, but then they eat outside the house. Now, of course, we live in a society now where it's common to have toilets in the house. In some places like where I grew up in, it's still common that the toilet is outside, or the latrine, call it the pit latrine, is constructed outside, and then you never use the house for that kind of business. It seems Herodotus came from a similar background where it was acceptable that the toilet or the bathroom has to be outside the house. But the Egyptians were different. The Egyptians had their bathrooms inside the house, but then they didn't eat inside the house. They usually ate outdoors. So he says, and then the Egyptians gave this reason, they alleging that whatever is indecent, though necessary, ought to be done in private, but what is not indecent, openly. So that's the explanation, that if something is indecent, it has to be done indoor, and something that is not indecent should be done outside. Now, another point he makes is that no woman can serve the office for a god or goddess, but men are employed for both offices. Now, the Romans, the Greeks, and maybe the Persians, and I'm not so sure about the Persians, but these two societies, especially the Greeks and the Romans, and remember Herodotus was a Greek, I think, the gods were usually served by both men and women. There were priests and virgin, whatever they were called, who attended to the affairs of the gods. But in Egypt, that was not the case. It was only men who served in those offices. That's according to what Herodotus writes. But I've seen other sources that explain that in Egypt there were women who served in the temple in some other capacity. In some capacity, I can't say what capacity, but I think I've come across documents or writings that say something like that. But this is what Herodotus kind of like tells us, that only men used to serve in the temples. And then another thing he found to be interesting among the Egyptians is that sons are not compelled to support their parents unless they choose, but daughters are compelled to do so whether they choose or not. So he found out that in Egypt, in the Egyptian society, the ancient Egyptian society, daughters were compelled that they had to take care of their parents when they are old, maybe, I'm thinking. But the sons were not. The sons could choose to do it or just avoid it, but the daughters had no choice. They had to take care of their parents. So he found that to be interesting, because I think in most societies it was the case that the sons were the ones to take care of the parents, because the daughters were assumed they will leave the family and go get married to a different family. But since this is not what the Egyptians saw it, he says in other countries the priests of the gods wear long hair. In Egypt they have it shaved. That's something else he noted, that the priests in Egypt would have their head shaved clean, while in other places it was the custom that the priests would usually have their hair full or grown. With other men, it is customary in mourning for the nearest relations to have their head shorn. The Egyptian, on occasion of death, let their hair grow both on the head and face, although accustomed to shave. Now, usually the Egyptian, the way Herodotus explained it, were people who had their head shaved. Not only even the priests and even ordinary people, they usually had their head shaved clean, and their faces too. So when somebody died in the family, it was the custom that they let the hair grow, which was the opposite of most societies he knew, I think. And even me, societies I know, most African tribes, when somebody dies, it's the custom that people shave. It's something so common in many tribes that when somebody dies in the family, the people will have their head shaved. But he found out the Egyptian will shave on a regular whatever, but when somebody passes on in the family, then they were forced to shave. He says in other societies, people lived aside from the animals. Like other society, usually the animals had their own space and the human beings their own space. But he found out that in Egypt, people lived with their animals in the same space. And he found that to be interesting enough that he had to write it down. And he also found something else. The Egyptians did not eat wheat and barley. I also found this to be so weird. I don't understand why they didn't eat wheat and barley, because wheat and barley is something that was so common in the ancient world. It was like a staple food in most societies. But the Egyptians did not eat it. Instead, they made bread from spelt, which some call zea. So it's some other type of grain that they used, but they didn't use wheat and barley. And also, he found out that they knead dough with their feet, but mix clay and take up dung with their hands. So again, they are doing the opposite. When they are kneading dough for bread, they used their feet. But when they were mixing clay, maybe for some other work, then they will use their hand. And he found that to be interesting. He also mentions about the Egyptians circumcising. And in fact, another part of the book, and I mentioned this in the previous video, Herodotus points out to us that in the ancient world, only Egyptians, Ethiopians, and the Colchians circumcised. The rest of the world did not. And he tells us that every man wears 2 garments, the women 1. That's another thing he noticed. He talks about fastening the rings and sheets of their sail outside. that's other people, but the Egyptians used to do it inside the house. Now it talks about the writing style. The Greeks wrote moving from left to right. Left to right. That was the Greeks, how the Greeks wrote. But the Egyptians from right to left. That's how the Egyptians wrote. And they say, doing so, they say they do it right ways and the Greeks left ways. So there was that difference of writing. And in fact, even today, there are scripts that are written right and others from left. So, and he says they had two sorts of letters. They had what they call the sacred and the other common. So writing could be done using the sacred and could be done using the common. I guess the sacred was used for religious purposes and the common was used for maybe commerce and administration and things like that. He says he found the Egyptians to be so religious because he writes, they are of all men the most excessively attentive to the worship of the gods and observe. Okay, he says he found them to be the most excessively attentive to matters to do with worshiping gods. And he says they carry out several practices, which I'm going to create a different video to talk about these religious practices. He says they wear linen garments, constantly fresh washed, and they pay particular attention to this. And of course, I've mentioned about circumcision, and he says the Egyptians used to say they will circumcise for cleanliness purposes. And he says they used to say it's better to be clean than handsome. That's what they used to say. Now about religious, I've said we are going to talk about religious practices in the next video. So I found this to be interesting. It gives us a glimpse of things that Egyptians did, and I found that to be interesting, and I hope you did too. So if you've not subscribed, subscribe and leave me a like if you don't mind, and leave a comment if there's something that came to your mind as I was explaining this, or you have a question, and I'll respond to those comments. See you in the next video.